Welcome to today's content-filled episode where instead of going over focal lengths and different lenses, we're going to review light. Now, just like in the last video, I'll be using the 800D, I found my tripod this time. For all of today's photos, I'll use the 55 to 50mm lens, for it is my preferred lens. And I'm just going to find a specific target, I'll point my camera at it, and all photos will be taken pointing at the exact same target for consistency. I'm going to explain the differences between ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, and how they all interact differently with the light your sensor receives, but they all have drawbacks, though sometimes you may not call them a drawback depending on what the outcome is that you are wanting. So stick around and we'll get started doing that now. Now, for this to be the most accurate presentation in the world, I'd really need more light control than this. I'm doing this inside my workshop. I've set up my camera, that's the 800D I just showed before, and that's a plant. It's in the corner, it's relatively shaded, light levels won't fluctuate much. Now, we're going to start by modifying ISO settings, then we're going to do the aperture, then we're going to do the shutter speed. As I'll do it, I'll put up the photos just like last time, demonstrating what changes as I do so, but also explaining what you'll start to see, apart from the obvious, some things get darker, some things get lighter. Now, let me get started by setting the camera up. Okay, so the camera's all set up, and we're just going to start by doing an AV, which is an automatic photo. We're just going to let the camera calculate everything, and I'll let you know what the camera chooses. From there, we will make changes to describe as best as possible what happens when you start changing things manually. So I've set the camera to a 2-second timer just to reduce any motion. For reference, the camera started off with an f-stop of 4.0. That is the widest the lens can go in sense of light. I'll explain that when we get to it. It's gone for a shutter speed of 50 milliseconds, which, sorry, 1/50th of a second, which is relatively slow depending on what you're doing. And it's cranked the ISO all the way up to 1600. 1600 is the furthest I let my cameras go. I don't like what happens when you go higher, and I'll explain why shortly. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to immediately set that into manual and match all of said settings. I'm going to take the exact same photo now as the camera set to manual. So starting with the ISO, we're going to lower the ISO all the way down to 100. This is the least ISO, which you'd also consider to be the darkest option. ISO artificially increases the light by increasing the sensitivity of the sensor. So we drag ISO all the way down to 100. The first thing you'll notice from the photo that I'll post on screen now, it's basically unusable, it's way too dark. Now, we put that past that 1600 and let's take it all the way up to 6400. I would never shoot this high, but for an example, this will be, this is an example. To exaggerate the issue with high ISO, I want to shoot one at 25,600. Apart from it being completely white, I'll zoom in on certain parts of the photo and you'll see that is very, very grainy. Now we'll go back and review this again in a little bit, once I change some other settings as well. Now, putting that ISO back to 1600, we're now going to change the f-stop up to an f-stop of 8. Changing the f-stop is a good way to get better sharpness out of your lens. All lenses have a maximum f-stop, a maximum aperture, which will be around, for my price range, is normally in around the 4. However, lots of cameras get a lot sharper as you start to put them past that. But by increasing the f-stop and by extension increasing the sharpness, you're sacrificing light. The way to think about it is, if you've got rings, as the f-stop increases, the hole for which light comes through gets smaller, and as the f-stop increases, the hole gets larger and letting in more light. Now, putting that back to 4, we're now going to change the shutter speed. First, we're just going to set it to 1 second. You'll immediately notice the picture is now very much white. It also takes longer to take the photo. The risk by increasing the shutter speed is that you increase the chance of a blur to come into the photo. Let's go all the way the other way to 1/250th. This is the speed I often shoot at because it gives me a good compromise where my photos are still sharp when handheld. Now, at this point, we've only been changing one setting at a time. So, I'm going to do a couple of examples to demonstrate what can happen when you change different things. And this is 1/40th, f-stop of 4, and an ISO of 1600. Now, I'm going to change stuff around. I much rather have a low ISO, so I want to set my ISO to 200. Now the picture is obviously too dark. Here's an example of what that picture looks like. I also like a slightly sharper image, so I'm going to put the image, the f-stop to 5.6. So now, as you'll see in this image, it's starting to get quite dark. Hardly what I'd classify as usable. However, I'm using a tripod. I don't need to move. I can let the lens do its own thing. So I'm going to go to 0.4 of a second. And now I've gone back to having a well-lit, very sharp image. Now, if we go take that a little bit more to the extreme, ISO 100, which will give me arguably the least amount of noise, the f-stop to 8, and then we're going to drag that all the way up to whatever the camera wants, which in this case is 1.6 of a second. You can see just from the sound, that's a lot of time for that photo to be taken, but I have a tripod, the target's not moving, we can do this. I now have what is arguably, at least in my opinion, a much better image. But let's take that to the other extreme. Let's say I keep the f-stop the same and I put this to let's go crazy. Let's go 1/250th. This image, I mean, the camera won't even let me take it because it's just black. The camera cannot focus. Now let's really crank that ISO up. We're going to put the ISO to 25,600. I've taken a photo. But now, as you can see on that photo, it is extremely grainy. If I split them down half and put them side by side, you can see one is considerably sharper than the other. Now, if you can't tell the difference, don't worry. YouTube videos and whatnot, not always the best place to compare photos. But believe me, the last photo I took is considerably darker than the first one. Now, let's turn this camera off. For this next bit, it requires some explaining. ISO is the artificial enhancing of light. You sacrifice noise, or you increase the amount of noise to get more light. The noise is normally dealable, you can deal with it. However, personally, I don't like noise. I'll try and keep my ISO below 800 at all times, ideally not over 400. But if my choice is to get a grainy shot, which is the noise, or no shot, I'd much rather take the shot and just get a higher ISO. So ISO increases light at the cost of noise or grain, whichever word you wish to refer to it. If we move on to the f-stop, without going into the complex technicalities of camera lenses, we're talking about the sharpness of a lens. All lenses are sharp in the middle, the most, and as you increase the distance from the center, you start to get a little bit less sharp. Increasing the f-stop, though not all the time, will increase the sharpness across the whole lens. You can't go from sharp to sharper. If it's already sharp, it will stay sharp, but those corners might suffer at a lower f-stop, such as a 4.0. Once the f-stop starts to go up on my 55-50 into the f8 range, the whole lens is a lot sharper. It's much more convenient. However, I'll sacrifice light. And this is the trend of this video. Everything you do has a trade-off between light or quality of some kind. Now, f8, not really a problem. I can normally get that back pretty quickly by just cranking the ISO up a little bit or by reducing the shutter speed. However, reducing the shutter speed now introduces a new issue, and that is blur. As you start to decrease the shutter speed, you have the issue where if you're moving or you're not steady or the target's moving, it will not be a sharp image. So to summarize all these things I've just touched on, f-stop, by increasing the f-stop, you usually increase the sharpness of your lens at the cost of light on the sensor. You choose which one you need most. ISO artificially increases the amount of light the sensor can detect. By decreasing it, you get a cleaner image. By increasing it, you get a grainier or noisier image. Again, depending on your use case, you might not notice or you might not care. And lastly, the shutter speed. Some cameras like mine, I can do 30 seconds. Great for night photography of things that don't move, absolutely useless at capturing things that move. And all the way to the faster end where I can do 1/4000th. The less time the camera is open taking said photo, the less light. And by extension, the darker it gets. So find the compromise between all three that suits the situation you're trying to photograph and work within that. Now, I'm just going to grab the camera and go out into my backyard, take a couple of photos, put those details down below of each photo that I've taken, just to give an example of what things look like when you change settings. I'll purposefully do some bad photos and I'll purposefully try my best to do some good photos with that same 800D camera. And then I'll put them all up, I'll put the words down below, and then we will say goodbye, I guess. As always, the content I try and cover is a little bit complicated, however the way I try to cover it is in the most simple way possible. So hopefully that is some helpful tips and understanding of how light behaves around cameras and photos and video for that matter. There is one more video planned for this series. There may be more as I progress, so look out for that in the near future. However, in the meantime, if you could like and subscribe, that would be really, really helpful. I have got some comments that have been really great. I've been able to help some people, I believe, and I hope to continue doing so with more complicated things in simple ways. So stick around for more, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you very much for watching.